So good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on renewable electricity in South Africa. Today we're going to run through a few slides, have a quick presentation to set up what I hope will be a very interesting panel discussion about the future of renewable electricity in South Africa. If you could skip on just a couple of slides, please, Alan. Just through the disclaimer onto the next one. So that's me there. The others, when we get to the, I think the presentation, the panel discussion, will be sharing their webcams. I won't, mainly because my upload speed isn't quite sufficient where I am, and I apologize if you can hear the cows in the background while I'm speaking. With me today from the AFRY side, we have Brendan Cronin, who is a director based in Dubai, looking after Middle East and has joint responsibility for our African developments, and Alan Whitaker, who's a senior consultant based in the UK, who's been working recently on the South African market. If I can just say, we're taking questions all the way through, so some of those questions we'll try and pick them up in the panel as well. And we'll get back to you after the event, both for registration questions and questions that people put in during the session. The slide pack and a recording will be sent out, so it will be available to you. And our series of webinars is available on the web as well, so you can pick up on past ones. We've covered a whole host of subjects, geographies and different sectors in the energy area and energy transition. So with that, I'll hand over to Alan, who will take us through the slides. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So the agenda today is, as Matt said, a brief background on the South African market and quickly touching on our long-term view of the generation mix in South Africa, followed by a panel discussion with some really good and interesting panelists. So on with the background then. So yeah, this is just a brief introduction to the renewable program in South Africa. So renewable capacity is centrally planned by the Department for Mineral Resources and Energy, the DMRE. So they run a sort of central optimization model of the South African system, and they publish the planned capacity expansion in the integrated resource plan. That planned capacity expansion is translated into tenders following a ministerial determination, and those tenders are run by the IPP office, which is an independent government agency. And I think that independence has been a really important part of the success of the program. So winning bidders from the tenders sign PPAs. They're paid as bid, and the tenders are guaranteed by the South African government effectively for 20 years. Overall, the REAP has been an extremely successful program, at least for the first sort of 4 or 5 years of its operation. So from 2011 to 2015, there have been sort of 4 major rounds and some sub rounds, so 6 auctions in total, and 3.6 gigawatts of capacity has come through. The prices have dropped dramatically. If you look particularly at solar PV, a lot of that is from international factors, the price of panels, turbines, etc. But it's also come from increased competition within South Africa, within the tenders, and also reducing transaction fees as people get used to the auctions and set up their supply chains in country. Since 2015, there's been quite a hiatus. It took 3 years for Eskom to sign the PPAs as the counterparty. Round 5 was initially due to launch in H2 2018, but it's been delayed until further notice, and we're still on the edges of our seats waiting for the minister to announce when that will be. So, it's been sort of 5 years since the last tender. In the meantime, auctions have been going on around the world, and prices continue to drop. So this is a sort of chart of the lowest price per technology in auctions elsewhere since 2014. South Africa, you've got some bigger blobs there. I think the points to take away is that prices have been dropping, particularly for solar. Solar now looks, we now expect solar to be lower than wind, perhaps for round 5. I think the other point to note is that South Africa, the blobs for South Africa are, in a given year lower than many other countries. Part of this is due to sort of fundamentals, so perhaps load factors being very strong in South Africa, but you have to be somewhat careful because some of it's to do with, the nature of the PPA. So that particularly the duration of the PPA. South Africa's got quite an average 20-year duration. But there are other aspects to do with risk allocation as well. But on the whole, I think it's widely accepted that the fundamentals are very strong for renewables in South Africa, even comparatively speaking with other countries. So we've got a sort of rough view of where we see prices for round 5. So PV being the lowest at roughly $24, wind at $29 per megawatt hour. This is the levelized cost of energy. Both, below the cost of conventional generation with the fuel prices we've assumed. Now, it's quite, I think we've assumed a coal price of about $2, which I think is okay. This is sort of done I think in January, pre-COVID. So the gas price of $6 is probably a bit, well, it's certainly a bit high. So, I think something more like $2 currently in the short term is closer to reality. So I think CCGT is closer to, wind and PV. Nevertheless, we see a very strong future for PV and wind, particularly if gas prices recover. So PV and wind down at the bottom, CCGT and coal competing in the middle, but then nuclear and CSP very expensive. It's hard to see a strong economic case for building those in South Africa. So if we take those cost assumptions and we run through our models, so we do price projections, system modeling, market modeling in many markets around the world. We do it for South Africa. We in effect we're running a program which is quite similar to what the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, the central planning function of the government for planning renewable capacity and other capacity. We've got more, we would say, up-to-date or aggressive assumptions on PV and wind costs. And as a result, we see quite a strong deployment of PV and wind out to 2050. So we've got 96 gigawatts of wind and solar by 2050. We see perhaps slightly closer balance between PV and wind, whereas I think the IRP is slightly in favor of wind. But it's still strong for both. And then finally, just it's important to note that this wind and solar capacity is supported by schedulable capacity, and we see that coming from a bit of GT gas turbines in the short term, and then CCGTs do get a look in, and also batteries are quite important. So shorter durations earlier, and then longer durations a bit later. So by 2050, 18 gigawatts of battery is not to be sniffed at. So that's my last slide. This is what the fundamentals suggest could be possible. I think you could be even more aggressive, depending on your view of what South Africa's exports could be, for example, in terms of other potential energy carriers like hydrogen or Fischer-Tropsch fuels or whatever. But this is a potential view. But of course, the reality depends on, the financial situation. It depends on policy, and I think these are things that we hope to touch on in the panel discussion. So with that, I'll hand over to Brendan.
Great, thanks, Alan. So I put my webcam on, and I think if the panelists can put the webcam on, it would be great to put your webcam on. I think we've had some technical difficulties with one or two. So I can see Hein, just to make sure everything's working, you can give me a wave. Yep, great. Bhavtik, good to see you. Thank you for managing to dial in. And we also have, yeah, Alan's going to turn his webcam on. Great. So thanks, Alan. And just to check, we have Mike. Are you there on the line? Say hello if you are.
Hi there. Yes, I'm on the line, but my camera's not working. Sorry.
Yeah, and Mali, we can see you as well. Great. So thanks, Alan. I think the only thing I'd say, just to kind of hesitate slightly, I think our levelized cost of energy, I think there may be an indication of where round 5 might land. I think it's clearly going to be dependent on, risk allocation and the PPAs, financing, size of projects. But, I think clearly we see, a further fall in the cost of renewable electricity in South Africa. We're hugely excited by the prospects in South Africa. When we run our fundamentals models, we get amazingly positive outcomes. But we've seen a stasis now for a couple of years, and I guess the first kind of broad question, just to get the discussion going, and I might just point it towards Mike, to get your view, Mike, to start off with what you kind of see as needed, or what can energize, given the fundamentals appear to be so strong, what do you think is needed to kind of restart the renewable development in a way?
Hi, Brendan. Good morning to all your listeners. I wish I could count on the fingers of one hand what we would need to do to get things moving again. We've, the last few years, I'm sure everyone has a different story about the delays. We certainly, I think, Eskom was a problem. It still is a problem. Their financial situation and their operational situation has not improved over the last 3 to 4 years. But I would say at least the stakeholders in South Africa now know that we have to do something around that. Last year, the Department of Public Enterprises in October published a roadmap as to, let's call it they use the word divisionalization, which is, I think, a polite way of kind of a first step to separation of the monopoly utility, but that still leaves some pretty horrendous financial issues. Now getting close to R500 billion of debt, which is, I think, realised that it's not sustainable for the balance sheet to carry that level of debt. There's lots of discussions how to deal with that, but of course that flows through as an impact as to the quality of the buyer on any PPA from Eskom, and who is going to support that. Clearly, South Africa's, let's say, macroeconomic and fiscal situation has also not improved over that time. We've had almost, well, we're now into very much negative growth, I think kind of minus 12%. I think before COVID-19, we were in a, let's call it real contraction. I mean, I think we were saying it was 0.3 or 0.4% GDP growth. So we have a sort of situation where I think COVID-19 has come along. To some extent, it may have distracted us, I think, from dealing with the issues. The IRP, after long delay and most necessary, because I think it's, we had tried a couple of times since 2010 to have a revision of this plan. It is the only official energy planning or electricity planning policy document that we have. So I think the realization was that the economics of particularly renewable energy and to some extent coal in the opposite direction had meant that there could be no credible electricity planning until we had that in place. It took probably longer than it should have, but as I say, the positive thing about it is it actually kind of sets out and formalizes to some extent South Africa's energy transition. okay, because we're going to close 11.8 gigawatts by 2030, probably about 29 by 2040, and of coal, and up to 2030 at least, where the plan goes, it says that in the main we're going to replace that predominantly with renewable energy, but with a bit of gas and battery storage. I think the coal is in there more as a certainly doesn't meet least cost barriers, but it's there really to kind of, I think, assist in terms of the transition. I guess what's happened post COVID-19? Well, you know, I was involved for the last 2 months in part of the drafting of, I guess, the post-COVID recovery plan, particularly on the energy side. Very clear understanding that the world has now moved towards green stimulus, whether it's Green New Deals and other such initiatives. South Africa also realizes, and you know, the IRP is very explicit that the least cost path for South Africa is a very heavy renewables process. But you know, we are driven by not only technical and economic factors. We have to get driven also by, you know, social economic factors. You know, our coal sector is 150 years old. It supports a very large community, probably 110, 120,000 people. Okay, and therefore the socio-economic implications of that transition are, and the political implications are very great unless there is a clear plan. You know, and the kind of the common used phrase now is what is the just transition and what is the just energy transition. And part of the problem, I guess, we have as the renewable energy industry down here, we've almost become conflated with the solution to the just transition, and often that has caused greater delays and sort of overcome, let's call it, the economic realities of the way we need to go forward. We've also allowed, you know, the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy has also stated quite plainly that mining companies and intensive energy users can go and build their own generation. It's not been quite as clear of that in terms of the amendments to the Electricity Regulation Act to allow for that, and I guess also more clarity around the issues of wheeling. You know, I think we have a lot of sectors where, you know, entering into essentially a 20-year lease is something that is difficult for them to plan for. Okay, so to be in a position where you probably can't very comfortably predict what you're going to be doing in 5 years' time, or electricity prices are going to be in 5 years' time, makes it quite difficult to commit to those type of long-term leases if you're not allowed to sell to a third party. So I think, you know, resolution around wheeling to other parties in case of, you know, early termination, I think becomes quite critical. Okay, I don't think the licensing issues, however difficult, are great. And all of that probably comes down to having a plan, you know, and ultimately that's probably the biggest problem of being able to get everyone around the table to put together a plan where everybody is pointing in the same direction. So I probably think I've said enough there, and I leave some time to say to the other panelists. Yeah. I think.
Well, I was going to follow up, and my plan was to ask Hein about when he thinks round 5 might happen, but I think it might be unfair. But maybe to Hein, I guess Mike's almost touched on it, and it's something we'd like to discuss on the panel. Is you know, there's the REAP, and it's been very successful. You know, if you want to take a punt and telling us when you think it might happen, that would be great. But it'd be interesting also to think about, from your perspective, how do you think the REAP is going to be the primary way we'll deliver projects in the next few years in South Africa, or do you think, you know, wheeling, you know, projects could be a way forward as well? It'd be great to hear.
Thanks, Brendan. As Alan mentioned previously in the webinars, that it's been 5 years since we had any procurement. So there's been quite a lot of active development ongoing in the background for being ready for round 5. But it's been kind of an emotional rollercoaster, stop-start in terms of increasing development activity and then slowing down again. So look, we anticipate that our planning is still that we would at least have an RFP out by the early start of next year, and hopefully bid projects into the second quarter of next year. So that's our current planning. We've seen NERSA accelerating, NERSA the regulator accelerating their process in terms of getting concurrence for the minister to make a determination for round 5's procurement. It is part of the RP. There's a lot of pressure on round 5 actually to go ahead as part of green stimulus packages and economic growth. But round 5 is going to be tough. We anticipate there's probably around about 8 to 10 gigawatts of projects that would be ready. We think they're going to procure around about 3 gigawatts in that area, so that would be oversubscribed significantly. In terms of around 5, what it may look like, I don't think they're going to change much. At least we need to have some continuity ongoing compared to previous rounds. What we do believe will change is the requirements for black ownership of projects, and to some extent the lack of direct black ownership in round 4 was part of the challenge of actually getting that signed eventually, in my opinion, as well. As far as private sector is concerned, I think from 2025 onwards, we would probably see a shift where there would be more energy procured through private sector than the government program. We also see opportunity for municipalities to start picking up. There's at least 5 big municipalities in the country can procure energy, and they're in a better position than Eskom, and probably won't need treasury guarantees to create bankable PPAs. We've seen the city of Cape Town being quite vocal and adamant to procure their own energy, and I think the other big 4 will follow suit as well. And what may be interesting is to allow the IPP office, who's doing the procurement now on behalf of the Department of Energy and Eskom's program, to run a similar program for municipalities. I think that's quite viable as well in the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, that's we see the trend. The few things that. Go ahead of that.
Hi, Brandon, it's Mali.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can also just maybe add to what Hein has been saying. I mean, I'm sure people are aware that just recently, in fact, just yesterday, the department released the determination for the emergency round. And in that determination, the emergency round, I think it's 2,000 megawatts, which need to, and the projects need to be up and running by the end of 2021. I think and they're supposed to release the RFP for that this month. Now, if government are able, or the IPP office is able to release the RFP this month, I think it will give impetus to what's going to happen in relation to round 5. Obviously, this particular emergency round is slightly different because it's for emergency electricity, but it will at least show that the IPP office is keeping to the timelines that they've promised, because they told us this month, and then for round 5, the other day they said it was going to be Q2 of next year. That's what, and I agree with Hein in relation to what stalled the last round was around economic development obligations and the like. I think we're anticipating that there will need to be bigger black economic empowerment and the like in the next round 5, because a lot of the developers or a lot of the people were raising those type of issues, in addition to the points Mike raised about
I don't think it's anything that's completely unique to South Africa. We see this in other parts of the world as well as a huge push. So I'm sitting in the Middle East, and the same things happening here. They want to bring not just they want to bring the supply chain in country. So it's natural that that will happen. I mean, I guess that's why our LCOEs might levelized costs projections might not be factoring all these kind of things in. But Malik, just on the wheeling point, I don't know if you have anything. From our point of view, we started to work a lot on corporate PPAs, including in South Africa, and they're really interesting projects and another way to bring forward renewable capacity, but they're often more difficult from a regulatory point of view. Do you see that the landscape right now? Do you think how achievable is a corporate PPA in South Africa right now? If you have a view.
I mean, the corporate PPA.
Sorry, carry on, Mali.
Carry on, Hein. No, please do.
No, okay. No, look, in terms of wheeling, the Electricity Regulation Act is quite clear. You know, if you've got a license to distribute or transmit energy, you need to allow third-party access. We've seen Eskom moving quite a lot in it for the past few years. They've done quite a lot of work on pricing. It's a complex model. The pricing is not prohibitive, but where we get stuck is licensing. Eskom is not really interested in engaging on talking about wheeling unless you have a license to generate, and that goes back into the Ministry of Energy of getting the necessary licensing in place before you can actually start talking about wheeling. The bigger challenge for wheeling for me is on the municipal level. Municipalities' revenue streams are very dependent on the sales of electricity. I would argue around about 40% of the income is from electricity. And we see municipalities trying to protect that revenue streams by, creating unsubstantiated high wheeling charges, which is not really fair in our view. But those are the biggest two issues: licensing and wheeling for the private market. But we also see that there's a carbon tax forthcoming in South Africa. And there's a lot of big industry players that's effectively lobbying very hard at the moment, saying, look, you want to tax our carbon emissions, but you don't want to allow us to buy green energy. So so there's lots of pressure from that front coming forward as well. Sorry, man.
Yeah. It's interesting. That's one of the areas of work for us in South Africa has been trying to understand, the cost of procuring electricity from other means versus the cost of procuring electricity from an IPP. Renewable IPP, and generally the numbers do look quite favorable, but it's having to give the IPP that long-term commitment they need for financing, and this may be a good time to ask.
And my views on where basically yes, whether or not what they think on some of the bankability issues in relation to some of, because that's really some of the difficulties we're going to have, and I think the bank is better placed to discuss how they have wrapped their head around those type of issues.
Yeah. So Bhavtik, it's probably a good time to ask you what you think about, do you think, you must be looking at corporate PPAs, I imagine, and how do you view them relative to the I guess fairly a little bit easier to understand and to value from a risk point of view, the government PPAs, the REIT PPAs. So how are you thinking about corporate PPAs and from a financial perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, everybody. I think look, when you are banking a national program project, like REIT as an example, where you've got essentially banking SA, so you've got the implementation agreement, government of South Africa standing behind the offtake obligations of Eskom. You're basically looking right through Eskom to the SA government. I think when you are looking at corporate PPAs, it's a very different scenario. So typically when you lend to a corporate, no matter how good the corporate is, seldom will you be able to lend out so, not even 10 years to pass. However, for an infrastructure deal like power is, 10 years is probably not going to do the trick from a tariff perspective, because what it means is that if you have a 10-year PPA, 10-year term of debt, you're trying to amortize that cost of CapEx. It just makes the tariff kind of palatable. Compared to what can be obtained on a big tariff. So I think the issue that we are grappling with is generally, there's a couple of initiatives that we have in mind to try and give you extended tenure into a corporate. But generally, probably I could say that tenors for a corporate PPA will not be as long as you're lending to a national utility like Eskom or others. I think there's also various other dynamics. So when you start looking at mines as an example, there's various other dynamics that actually come into play. So typically, there've been a number of PPAs, corporate PPAs out there. Some would be for mines. When you start looking at a mine, things like whatever the commodity is that is coming out from that mine, that has to be looked at. What is the life of the mine? What is the market outlook price? For example, if you're looking at platinum right now compared to what platinum price was, say, 6-10 years ago, it's a very different scenario. So those sort of factors come in, and I think also it's the price risk or the volatility market price risk. So when you start looking at the South African wheat program, as you know, the tariffs have been in rands, it's a rand PPA, and generally the bulk of the funding has been from South African commercial banks. We start looking at the corporate PPA that is possibly not in rands. There's a different dynamic to it from a funding perspective, potentially, and exchange risk. I think generally, I agree with the comment that was made earlier on. I certainly see that corporate PPAs, the moment the legislation has actually changed to accommodate this, I certainly see that there will be a large number of these coming to market. We see a lot of clients already bracing themselves for what is potentially imminent change in legislation.
Thank you. It's interesting. I guess it'd be interesting. One of the things that AFRY does a lot of in many markets around the world is, renewables typically have 10, 15, 20-year PPAs, but now the lifetime tends to be 30 plus years. And we do a lot of post PPA, what's going to happen after the PPA, and it's quite an easy thing to do in a market where there's a wholesale market, because you can project the wholesale price. I guess in South Africa it's a little bit more complex. I don't know, Hein, it'd be interesting to know how do you guys think about kind of post PPA? Do you take a view on what's going to happen after your 20-year PPA, and how do you think about it in a market like South Africa? Hein, I think you might be on mute, possibly.
I'm on mute, apologies. We've got a storm in Cape Town, so it's quite noisy on my side. I don't think, in terms of being competitive in a government procurement process, that you cannot assume a tail on a PPA. So it all depends on how aggressive equity players wants to be around that. In all likelihood, the assumption is that there would be a sale of energy post the initial PPA. And we expect that would either be through short-term PPAs into private markets or into some kind of liberalized market in the future. But generally, people do expect there's a sale of electricity after PPAs.
Yeah, no, makes sense. I mean, maybe turning a bit more towards kind of short-term issues, and maybe perhaps Mike, back to you. I think you mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're still trying to get some projects into operation from the earlier rounds, and I'm just wondering how coronavirus and COVID-19 is impacting that, or more generally, how do you think COVID is going to play into things in the near term?
We certainly did have some issues, particularly straight after lockdown, because there was clearly a huge debate, and I'm sure this was exactly the same in other jurisdictions, as to what constituted critical sectors. So what you found was it was very easy to get a renewable energy project declared as a critical site, which allowed allowed for staff to maintain and operate. A lot of the round 4 projects that were sort of maybe halfway through were regarded just as normal construction sites, so they were closed down. You were only allowed security, and I think what became problematic, and maybe what it exposed in South Africa, was a lot of the skilled staff had to return home. So even though we've managed to get the round 4 project sites up and going again, we're facing problems with regards to visas to allow skilled staff from Europe to come back in and to help sort of finalize. In many of the cases, the projects were very close to energizing. Medium to longer term, it's so difficult to say. I mean, I think, as we're seeing in other parts of the world, we think we have coronavirus under control, and suddenly we flare up. Where I'm sitting in Gauteng, we were sitting watching the Western Cape with numbers rising there. Now it's going crazy here. So we were in what was known as stage 3. I suspect we may go into stage 4 and stage 5. Certainly, I can say from my perspective, particular cases, is you can't go out to look at any sites. So that is kind of slowed down. I think as I said, I think there's a clear view that, you know, a green and renewable rich process is the way forward. It's the quickest way for us to get megawatts onto the grid. We clearly need to learn, I think, from REAP, in the sense that we need to take a more strategic view about what our renewable energy sector looks like going forward. Certainly from Labour side and from many parts of government, you know, the jobs that are measured in REAP, particularly say construction jobs, are not ones that would be measured by Labour in particular as decent jobs or equivalent jobs. So it really does come round for us having to look at how do we develop the manufacturing value chains in South Africa and create you know, permanent jobs, particularly in the coal mining areas, and where you know I mean the situation is reasonably dire there already, and we need to address that. And as I say, it shouldn't just be renewable energy. There's lots of other sectors, but the fact is that we are having to go through this very large transition. The least cost path of IRP says we should only build renewable energy. That means it's got to be able to play probably a more encompassing role than it's played sort of up to now.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. One of the things just that I was surprised by when I kind of first started looking at the South African market is the fact that the projects were predominantly financed by local banks, which is, you know, in contrast to many of the other kind of markets that you know, prompt for renewable capacity starts developing quickly. And I'm just wondering, you know, partly with COVID, Bhavtik, but also more generally, if we have big volumes of renewables coming forward in the next kind of 5-10 years, fingers crossed, what capacity, or do you think there's going to be still predominantly local bank lending, or do you think the international banks are going to be involved? Be interesting to know.
So I think, look, I think South Africa is peculiar compared to, you know, most other African markets, right? Because a lot of the projects done in South Africa are all sort of RAN funded, you know, it's a RAN PPA, right, tariffs. And what it means is that the South African commercial banks essentially, you know, have the ability to actually fund in RAN far more competitively than international banks. If you look at, and that is why to date in the South African program there's been very, very limited participation by any international. I think one or two exceptions, DFIs, the non-South African DFIs, and some international DFIs where, you know, there was technology issues, as an example, CST projects, which were kind of relatively unproven. CST Tower as an example, CST truck. But I think generally, if you look at mining in South Africa relative to, say, power, generally, you know, the exposure that South African banks have to the mining sector is significantly higher than what we have to sort of power. So I think generally, you know, if you look at it as an example where the South African government bond is trading versus, you know, the sort of returns that you are getting for developing a renewable energy project, which is essentially quasi-government risk, and you have the implementation agreement, you know, backing ESCOM. I think the appetite is still going to be large for this. And from a funding perspective, I think there's still a lot of appetite by the institutional market in South Africa, asset managers, pension funds, etc., who have now become big takers of these asset classes. And I think this exercise that we've done, certainly, it does not indicate that there's any constraints. It's certainly not in the short to medium term for continuing to fund energy assets. I think the world has moved on. And South African banks certainly have changed their stance accordingly. You know, I think it's become far more challenging to fund coal-fired power generation, which was a thing of the past. And I think the appetite for renewables is certainly growing significantly. So I don't see that there will be a constraint in the short term. In fact, if I flip the question, if I look at, you know, what was the 3,000 megawatt you know, gas-fired power generation program, the LNG to power, when we had done that exercise, there was still more than enough liquidity from the South African banking markets to actually fund that full capacity. And I haven't even spoken about, you know, potential involvement of, you know, international should either rise, or, you know, DFIs from abroad should either rise, ECAs, right? So we haven't used that, but, you know, that is certainly an alternative.
No, it's interesting. And you touched on gas to power just there at the end. That was maybe one of the, we're coming to maybe the last 5 minutes or so, but maybe to conclude, I was interested in talking a little bit about the generation mix, and maybe back to Hein. I think so. One of the things in our modelling that's come out is we see, and this is about assumptions, probably a little more of a balance towards solar over wind, but but absolutely we see both, and we see wind being actually a better fit with demand, even though it's perhaps now maybe slightly higher in price. But I'd be interested to get your reaction to that, and also what you think about the longer term generation mix. And then storage is battery storage most commonly is an oft talked about technology. And what do you think the prospects are in South Africa for storage, alongside renewables?
Well, I'll start with the last question first. I think storage is like in South Africa, like everywhere else in the world, is going to have a significant impact. But I do think for storage for South Africa, is going to be two trigger events. The one is Eskom. Eskom is obliged in terms of previous loans from the World Bank to install at least about 500 megawatts of storage. That's come to a stall, but I mean, eventually we assume that will pick up again. And then the emergency procurements that Mali has mentioned previously, that would be technology agnostic, and there would be kind of a mid-merit dispatchability requirement in that. So that may be interesting in terms of bringing in storage together with renewables on that front. And that would be a requirement in the next 12 to 18 months in terms of actually starting constructing that. So yeah, storage is going to have a big impact in South Africa in the future. In terms of why we see a little bit more wind than solar in the RRP planning, my understanding of that's only related to the time of generation. South Africa's morning and evening peak is not covered by solar enough, so wind is covering evening peak quite nicely, especially in the Northern Cape with thermal driven wind resource. That's probably why the model is preferring wind a little bit more than solar, just because of time of generation. That also makes a good compelling argument for why wind together with solar, together with storage, is actually quite an interesting prospect for South Africa moving into the future.
Yeah, no, I don't think we would agree with that. That wind ends up being quite a very good fit with demand. It's not as doesn't have the diurnal shape that solar does. So I think that's right. Mali, I don't know. Norton Rose is a big international firm. Whether from your perspective you have any kind of views on what you see your clients kind of on your own views of how the generation mix in South Africa might be. Do you see it being primarily renewables, or gas to power is something that people have been interested in but has seemed to have stalled as well?
Yeah, a combination of renewables and gas to power. You'll remember a few years ago there was a lot of talk around the gas to power. Unfortunately, it stalled, but we definitely see that coming back and it being part of the energy mix. That's where the discussions we've been having with clients and what have you, but renewables being the main focus, we feel.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'm gonna, we're getting towards 45 minutes, so I think I'm going to draw the panel to a close. I remember in my haste I've realized I haven't formally kind of named you and your company, so maybe just in concluding, I'd like to thank Hein from Mainstream, Bhavtik from ABSA, Mali from Norton Road, and Mike from Cabby Solar. I think it's been great to kind of have you guys and get a bit of it's certainly been very interesting discussion for me to hear what's going on. I hope our participants found it useful as well. Thank you for your time, panelists. Thank you for your time, Alan. Thank you for the presentation, and I think we'll draw it to a close. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay. Bye.